Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Alastair.
And I'm Nick.
And today we'll be discussing the comic adaptations X-Men Apocalypse and Preacher. We will be reviewing Jeremy Saulnier's punk thriller Green Room and finding out what Nick thought about Cammell Laird Social Club from Half Man Half Biscuit. But first, Nick, what have you been watching this week?
Unusually, I'm going to do some music this time. I've been listening to the new Radiohead album, A Moon-Shaped Pool.
Is it good?
It's quite good, I think. It's the first track, Burn the Witch, which was like the big lead-off single, or sort of lead-off YouTube track anyway. That's really excellent. The rest of it, I haven't listened to it enough times to really separate out the rest of it into which bits I really like yet. It's all a sort of general Radiohead sounding noise at the moment. But it does like quite a well-made noise. I think I'd probably have had more time to get into this one if I hadn't been trying to make sure I was familiar with that Half Man Half Biscuit album for the recommendation later. But yeah, I think it's good. It seems a bit more distinct than King of Limbs. There's a bit more fast and slow, whereas King of Limbs did kind of, even after I've listened to it loads and loads, it sort of still blurs into one a bit when I'm actually in the middle of it.
Oh, cool. Well, I'm looking forward to listening to it at some point.
I don't know, with music, the big thing for me is whether it stands the test of time, and it's obviously too early to tell, but I'm quietly optimistic, I think. How about you?
This week I watched the live episode of The Simpsons that they did. It's their 27th series, which is mind-bending. It's been going on this long. And I guess they've got to find some way to keep it fresh and interesting. So they did an episode about 3 to 5 minutes or something of it were live.
This is probably the obvious stupid question, but how is it live? Is it as in word the animation was pre-prepared and the voice actors were performing live?
It's kind of, Homer just sort of sits behind a desk, and so the only animation is just his mouth moving, and it was broadcast live, but the dialogue was improvised and done live, and they had people phoning in to speak to Homer, although I think they pre-screened the phone calls, but he basically just sits behind a desk.
Okay, that sounds technically impressive, I guess. Was it actually entertaining?
It was okay, I'd say.
It was a Latter-day Simpsons episode.
Yeah, that was it. It did strike me as this is a bit of a gimmick. I mean, although it's impressive they were able to do a cartoon live, the fact that it was basically The Simpsons really went off the boil quite a long time ago means that maybe better if they kind of focused on writing good stories rather than, I guess, doing gimmicks.
But to get to series 26, I guess the idea of good stories has just dissolved into the vortex, hasn't it? It's just here's another one.
It's probably around season 12 or something that it generally just kind of disappeared off a cliff. But I think at this point, I think The Simpsons needs to be quietly put down rather than carrying on.
Much like that dog was in the very first one. Or did that dog just run away? I can't remember.
The first episode, they get a dog.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I was just inserting death into it because I'm
right at the beginning, it says that their cat got run over. Their first cat was run over. That's why the cat is called Snowball 2.
As long as there's a dead pet somewhere, I feel slightly validated in my memory. Alright, first up this week is X-Men Apocalypse, which is the 6th film in the X-Men series, and I believe the 9th film in the Fox X-Men franchise as a whole, if you count all the Wolverine-y, Deadpool-y ones. It features the X-Men. This is the past X-Men introduced in First Class and Days of Future Past, going up against the big blue villain Apocalypse, best known for lots and lots of comic stories, including Age of Apocalypse, and being in the 90s cartoon quite a lot. I love that cartoon. Anyway, this film has just come out. I guess it's meant to be the end of the sort of trilogy with First Class and Days of Future Past, and it's had somewhat mixed reviews. Some people seem to think it was alright. Forbes magazine called it a franchise-killing disaster. Alastair, what did you think of it?
It wasn't great, I guess is my initial impression. I mean, it's entertaining enough when I was in the cinema watching it. I know it's got plenty of sort of bangs and flashes, so in a sense it's a sort of entertaining spectacle, but I don't think it really had a lot of substance behind it. I mean, I do really think there was quite a lot of empty spectacle. There was, it kind of did just sort of careen from kind of explosion to explosion. The plot, such as it was, I think got buried somewhere along the way.
It had the sort of modern sci-fi disaster up the stakes standard of cities being destroyed, but it didn't really feel that weightful. It was partly because I'm not sure there were particularly good sequences, and partly because I think we've just become a bit numb to city destruction, and we just weren't, because Apocalypse wasn't a very good villain, it was hard to get that invested in all.
Yeah, I think one of the main problems is that quite a lot of the main stars didn't really want to be in this film. You could tell that Jennifer Lawrence and Michael Fassbender were basically just phoning it in.
I can't tell if Michael Fassbender was phoning it in because he just wants to be shot, or because his storyline was clearly a bit superfluous and pointless.
I mean, one of the many issues I had with this film was that they didn't really have one main story that they should have gone with. I mean, it had loads of different stories all over the place. They had the main plot, I guess what was the main plot, which was Apocalypse, who's this kind of, ancient mutant from, the Egyptian times or perhaps earlier, has come back to enslave the world. They were trying to continue the plot of, the relationship between, Professor X and Magneto. They had another plot involving, the young X-Men, like the first time Scott and Jean meet each other.
I see again, I'll be defending the terrible comic film. I semi-disagree. I think the plot was actually quite straight down, wasn't it? I mean, I guess you had Apocalypse and the X-Men and then they came together, but there wasn't that much else happening. I mean, there was a few sort of subplotty bits, but it was a fairly direct, straight line through the film, to be honest. It was not that disparate. I mean, Jennifer Lawrence had a couple of sequences elsewhere, and then she joined the main plot with the X-Men. We'll probably be doing spoilers, but as ever, skip the sequence if you don't want to hear them. So, yeah, mansion, military base, fight with Apocalypse. It wasn't a Batman v Superman level of 17 different things are happening. It's just, unfortunately, the plot wasn't that interesting because the plot revolved around Apocalypse, and unfortunately, considering how central he obviously is to the movie X-Men Apocalypse wasn't very good.
No, that was one of the issues, and Oscar Isaac was completely wasted in that part. I mean, under those layers of makeup, it could really have been anyone. And it was just kind of generically hammy villain. I mean, the villain just wanted to enslave the world because he's evil.
Yeah, it's annoying because as squandered opportunities go, that's probably one of the biggest ones. I mean, he is, as I gather they say in the mainstream, very much a hot young actor of the moment. Having him as the villain should have been a bit of a coup, but you could barely recognise him.
Yeah, I don't know, that didn't really work. And I think they tried, because this kind of prequel trilogy of First Class, Days of Future Past, and now Apocalypse, I think the idea is it's supposed to be filling in the story of how we got to the position we are, at the beginning of the original X-Men. I think this prequel trilogy has told that story, and especially focusing on the relationship between Professor X and Magneto and how they got to the point where they are. The problem is that just, they could have done a good story finishing off that aspect of the story, but there just wasn't enough, substance to the Magneto storyline.
Yeah, I honestly feel like they could have given Magneto the film off. I mean, partly because Michael Fassbender does look like he'd rather die than do another one, but also because he didn't really have a substantial role in it. He turned up to an extent just because it's an X-Men film and they have Magneto in them. And, I mean, it's unfortunate that I'm now saying this because, obviously he was very good in the first two films in the prequel trilogy, and Ian McKellen was very good in the 4 films he's now done as Magneto. But on this occasion, I don't know, on the one hand I feel like this would have been a better film if they just accepted that there's not really a part for Magneto in this and just let it be an Apocalypse film. But on the other hand, then it might have been even worse because Apocalypse is terrible, so it's hard to really know.
I think you're right that they should have either done a film that was about Professor X and Magneto or done a film that was about Apocalypse. I mean, there isn't enough of the story of the relationship between Professor X and Magneto. There's not really enough about the young X-Men, about sort of Jean and Scott and how they, meet and get together. There's not really enough of that. And the Apocalypse storyline itself is just generic movie villainous. There isn't enough substance there to form a story. I really think they should have just chosen one avenue and gone with that rather than trying to do lots of different things.
It's odd. A lot of the recent superhero films, even Civil War, which, paved over a lot of its problems with a sense of zippy fun, but still, have the problem of too many characters, too many plots. So as X-Men Apocalypse weirdly seem to have too many characters, but not many plots. They have too many characters, a lot of whom are just sort of standing there.
Yeah, I certainly think the problem was too many characters. I think this film had the same problem that Avengers Age of Ultron had, which is, too many characters and not enough space for them to breathe properly.
If they'd taken basically all of Magneto's time out and cut down the long rambling sequences of Apocalypse, more X-Men basically, because, I'm going to say some positive things now because I think it's probably about time. Yeah, the actual X-Men in X-Men Apocalypse were mostly quite good, to be honest, with the slight exception that I think Jennifer Lawrence has somewhat lost interest. The rest of them were good. The new young kids were clearly, excited to be there. They injected a bit of enthusiasm into it. I quite liked Sophie Turner as Jean Grey. I thought she did the sort of frightened but strong thing quite well. The new kid playing Cyclops could go either way.
He had more personality than, I can't remember who it was, but the man who played Cyclops in the original.
He was a bit better than James Marsden, I think, in that he had a bit more take control stuff to do. I don't know, they could have maybe given him a few moments to show his leadership skills, considering leadership skills is one of Cyclops' defining personality traits.
Yeah.
But still, he was a decent enough action teenager. The new kid playing Nightcrawler was fun. James McAvoy, since he actually did have a role in the plot, he did a pretty good job of it. Yeah, in fact, in many ways, massive spoiler, sorry, the entire film was basically the story of how Professor X went bald. That might have been the primary contribution this has made to the mythos. So
Yeah, that seems to be it.
Yeah, he was good. It's weird because we've reached a point in the franchise where they clearly think, well, you've seen the heroes, so therefore we can spend more time with our new villain because that's the big selling point. But because of the way this franchise works, we actually haven't seen a lot of these heroes before, or these versions of these heroes. So I ended up wanting more time with Cyclops and Jean Grey.
Yeah, I think the best bit of the story was, like I say, the young X-Men, Cyclops, Jean Grey, Nightcrawler, and I would have preferred more time with them, more time building up, their characters, rather than just these additional plots that were just sort of thrown in. I thought Quicksilver was great in this film.
I thought he was good. His sequence where he saved everybody.
Yeah, I mean, he was really good in the last film, Days of Future Past.
Well, yeah, the Quicksilver slow motion scene. I thought there was a certain element of, you seemed to like this last time, so we're damn well doing it again. But on the other hand, it was still fun and entertaining. So
it was probably the best sequence in the film.
Yeah, he was fun, and he got to hang around a bit. He's good for some jokes. But I liked the X-Men lineup they settled on at the end of the film. Despite my complaints about this film, I did come away thinking, okay, I would turn out for another film starring those X-Men. That was a decent setup.
Yeah, the configuration they left the X-Men in at the end of the film, getting closer to the sort of classic X-Men lineup. I wonder if they will make any more films. I can imagine there's no way they're going to get Jennifer Lawrence or Michael Fassbender or James McAvoy back. They all look like they were really not enjoying being in this film.
I thought James McAvoy did alright. I quite liked they sort of moved him a bit more towards the settled, inspirational Professor Xavier and slightly cut down on the
moodiness.
We're going to reveal when Professor Xavier is young and a bit crap.
Yeah, where he's young and impulsive rather than being...
Yeah, so I thought, if they're going to round off his trilogy, and if indeed this is his last appearance, I thought it was nice that they finished it by basically bringing him into classic Professor Xavier mode. I actually don't have a massive problem with James McAvoy in this. I thought he did his stuff.
Of all the actors who clearly didn't want to be there, he was the one who actually managed to put a brave face on it and deliver a performance. Maybe because he had a larger role to play.
I still don't think he came across as not wanting to be there, but fair enough. But yeah, the best sequence of the film for me, though, not actually the Quicksilver bit. I quite like the bit in the military base. I've seen that complained about in reviews because there was a bit of, this is clearly a massive detour added in so that they can do a Wolverine cameo.
Yeah, I wasn't a huge fan of that sequence. I failed to see what it actually added to the overall plot. It was just seemed like another action scene in the middle of the film. Because they've got the bit when Quicksilver saves everyone from the mansion, and that goes straight into the military base fight sequence, and then that goes straight into the final fight sequence.
Yeah, but at least it was actually some nice close quarters, hand-to-hand superhero stuff. I quite enjoyed that, whereas the final fight sequence was a bit people jigging around in front of a digital matte painting thing. Yeah,
the ending did become very much just an enormous amount of special effects.
Yeah, everyone's sort of standing in the middle of special effects, and to the extent that you can tell that they're not really there, and it's sort of like Magneto's weird stationary bubble, or whatever the hell that was. Everyone just voided off in these little pockets which feel completely inorganic.
Yeah, I mean, it was quite a disjointed ending, and by right at the end, it did become really Power Rangers. Basically, in order to kill Apocalypse, they had to all combine their powers and hit him at the same time. So Magneto had to throw some metal, and Cyclops had to shoot him with his eye laser, and Storm had to strike him with lightning, and Jean Grey had to use the Phoenix. And then I was very this is just the Power Rangers. This is just again, it's a villain in a sort of ridiculous costume that that I don't really feel invested in any way. That's just something for people to punch, and just then people combining their powers and then blowing them up and then cut to end.
It did get into one of my least favourite genres of superhero fight, which is we're all going to sort of stand in a circle and look constipated at each other, and whoever looks the most constipated wins. But as someone has pointed out to me, that is a bit of a trope of X-Men stuff, much like the sort of Mindscape psychic fight, which also happens here, which is kind of a bit lame, but on the other hand, it does involve Professor X, and Professor X is very much the daddy of Mindscape psychic fights. So if they're going to do one...
yeah, might as well.
But yeah, the ending fight was, I think, where the slight goodwill I built up from sort of the young X-Men sequences did kind of die off as everyone just ran around next to the CGI. Yeah, a special sympathy shout out to Olivia Munn as Psylocke, who I think got particularly boned here.
She didn't have a particularly good part.
She gave some interviews saying she was apparently talking about doing the girlfriend part in Deadpool, the one that eventually went to Morena Baccarin, but she chose Psylocke instead in her negotiations with the Fox X-Men franchise because she wanted to be, a kick-ass heroine rather than a girlfriend. Now, I can see that that's a good principled stance, but in practice, all she did in this film was pose in a swimsuit and say about 2 lines.
you can't tell what a film's going to be like before it's been made, and
not.
probably even before it's been written at that point.
Yeah, whereas Miranda Bakarin's past in Deadpool, I mean, it was a bit girlfriend, but, you know, she had some character and some spark and some humour and some life. You came away thinking Miranda Bakarin was quite good in that. I enjoyed her character, whereas I came away from this thinking, wow, Olivia Munn had nothing to do and was wasted.
Her part was, I don't know, yeah, only consisted of about 2 lines, looking menacing, wearing next to nothing, and doing some special effects. I mean, it is kind of a cliche of superhero films, is basically, we've got a female part, but it'll involve wearing basically no clothes, especially being quite underdressed for combat, and basically have almost no personality and no opinion, while you stand next to basically men looking serious. So it's not an amazing advertisement for feminism in superhero films.
Yeah, she and Storm. The new Storm didn't really get a massively good intro. Basically, Storm, Psylocke, Angel, and Magneto are the 4 horsemen of Apocalypse. Like, Apocalypse's action in the first half consists of him going around and recruiting these horsemen, basically by brainwashing them. Although Magneto, for some reason, doesn't seem to be quite as brainwashed. But the other 3 do just stand in the background, posing and having no opinions or influence on the plot whatsoever. They're just there to be meet for the fight scene at the end.
I think Storm had a little bit more personality.
Storm got to have a slight change of heart, which leaves me completely baffled about how Apocalypse's brainwashing is meant to work, but never mind.
Yeah, I think that brings me to another criticism of the film, which is, what is Apocalypse's powers? He's just generically evil and generically powerful. I mean, you don't want to get too bogged down in the technicalities of how the film's supposed to work within the context of its universe. But generally the way the X-Men work is each X-Men has a power, and they play off each other. Some powers work well together, some work against each other. Like, what I think is always interesting is basically Wolverine can't hurt Magneto. It's just not possible because Magneto controls metal and Wolverine has a lot of metal inside him. And I thought, there's an interesting play-off between those abilities and how they interact. But I think it's kind of going against the kind of rules of the X-Men universe when you have one person who's just godlike powerful. They don't have any particular power. It's not like, Professor X who can control people's minds. He just was powerful. I don't really, he didn't add anything to the character. I mean, it's part of my general criticism that the character of Apocalypse had no substance. He was just generically evil and generically powerful.
The in-universe explanation, I guess, was that he's been a disembodied entity for millennia or whatever, inhabiting mutants and taking their powers. So therefore he's just got a general large power set. But you're right, the net result is what you said. He just becomes this general entity who just waves his hand at stuff.
I know, it feels like, a bit Deus Ex Machina, or just pulling things out of a box. So basically, whatever Apocalypse wants, he can just wave his hands at it and it happens.
Yeah, it's the ridiculously overpowered nature of him, and it's the fact that he just wasn't a character. He didn't want anything or do anything or say anything particularly beyond general things about how the world must be destroyed and remade because he doesn't like 80s television. Was that it?
That was basically his motivation in a nutshell.
Man, driven nuts by shit game shows.
If the explanation is that he's moved from body to body over the years, and if you move to the body of a mutant, he takes that power and then adds it to the powers he already has and keeps going. But then there's one bit when he sees a television and then just kind of touches the television and absorbs all the knowledge, so he understands what this world is like. And I was like, he's from ancient Egypt. How does he know what a television is? And why does he have a power related to televisions?
At some point, he's absorbed the power to absorb knowledge from coaxial cables. I don't know. At some point in ancient Egypt, I don't know. Maybe he's killed 17 mutants off screen between him waking up and him going to Storm's flat. Well, he can't have done because he just staggers out. Oh, I don't know.
I guess whilst we've been trashing the end of this film, I'd like to take some time to trash the opening of the film as well.
What, the bit where you start to worry you might have accidentally started watching a Stargate?
Yeah, it was like, it needs to have the opening of like Stargate mash the opening of The Fifth Element, but it's not as fun as either of those. I mean, I can't imagine imagine being in the pitching session for this movie. The director goes like, fade in, ancient Egypt, and people are like, oh god, this is going to be bad. I know, yeah, there's just a bit at the beginning of the film that's just like, again, all the stereotypes of an ancient Egypt thing. We've got like men only wearing sort of cloths around their loins, bowing down and worshipping, Apocalypse, and then, and a pyramid that collapses. And yeah, again, there's like all the cliches of like have a bad science fiction film with origins in ancient Egypt.
Part of me wants to respect them for going full Apocalypse, really doing his classic comic design and really committing to his I am a massive supervillain aesthetic. But I'm not entirely sure whether it just hasn't worked on the screen because there's just something wrong about seeing that in reality. Whereas you too are a big fan of the 90s cartoon, aren't you? Or at least you remember watching it and enjoying it.
Oh yeah, I loved it when I was a kid. Pretty much all my knowledge of X-Men comes from that cartoon.
Honestly, kind of same here. X-Men is not one of my main comics fandoms. But do you remember Apocalypse in that? I
Yes,
assume.
I remember that. I remember there was some plot in where he kidnapped all of the psychic X-Men.
Yeah, I mean, he worked in that as a villain, didn't he? He was fine. He was, a big villain.
Yeah, he worked in that. I mean, there is an element with a 90s children's cartoon is that you can be a bit more villains are just generically evil. Character substance isn't necessarily one of the selling points of a children's cartoon, but he was much better in that cartoon than he was in this film.
Was that just because in the cartoon everything was as childishly simple as he is? Or was he just particularly badly written in this film? I can't decide.
Well, the cartoon had a bit more substance than the average Saturday morning cartoon, because X-Men has a bit more substance than the average kind of, action flick you see in the cinema. But I think what Apocalypse worked at is a kind of, this guy is really powerful and requires people to unite against him. So it's the storyline of, how do we get enemies to put aside their differences and unite? But again, because there was too many plots in this film, there wasn't really enough of that, so there could have been more.
Yeah, I don't know. As I say, part of me wants to say I really respect them for doing Apocalypse as he appears, but I can't say it particularly works. He's just too two-dimensional. But if they actually given him any actual camaraderie or relationships with his sidekicks other than them just standing behind him, then maybe it would have helped. I mean, there was a hint of a actual relationship between him and Storm when they were first talking, but that just stopped.
Yeah, exactly. That was any moments where it could have had substance, sort of disappeared. And you got the story about Magneto losing his family, and you can get there's a lot of scope for
his pointless family who had been
drama
introduced just to make him upset.
Yeah, it was.
That was a fridging, to use the technical internet term, if there ever was one.
Yeah, that was definitely a fridging of the First Order.
The bit where Magneto subsequently kills a bunch of soldiers was quite a cool Magneto sequence, and I think it was the only cool Magneto sequence in the film, so that was nice.
Yeah, the bit when his family die and there's in the forest, that was good.
And Michael Fassbender, I think, did sort of go, right, this is clearly the one bit in the script where I actually get to do something that resembles acting. I'll try and make it work.
Yeah, he did do a good performance in that scene.
To bring in the inevitable comparison, it's probably not actually as bad as Batman v Superman. But there are bits that definitely work, and I did come away thinking, even though I don't think this film works, I'm probably still broadly on board with the franchise. But it was, I think, just boring, which I think annoys me more than Batman v Superman, which Batman v Superman was bad, but it was bad in people had really sat down, thought about it, and committed to ways to make that film bad. Whereas X-Men Apocalypse, it just wasn't that much interesting about it. It just didn't even look that interesting. I mean, I don't often critique the direction because, I don't know, it's not something I feel that qualified to critique at length, but this film did not look overly interesting for the most part. It looked kind of dated, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think one of the big flaws is that you've got X-Men, which is a comic that has some substance to it, as I said, and it's got these great characters, and also, you've got like Magneto, a villain which has, a huge degree of complexity to him. You can see obviously there's the obvious parallels of racism and oppression that, run through X-Men, and, has been handled very well in past X-Men films.
Even ignoring the specific characters of Magneto and Professor X, the reason X-Men has been successful is because it has its sort of central minority metaphor which kind of works. Yeah. Apocalypse barely ties into that metaphor at all. I mean, the fact that he is a mutant, I guess, could theoretically cause more mutant hatred because a mutant has done all this, but it's not really addressed.
I know, they could have done a film with some substance to it, and a film that has something interesting to say. But instead, they do have a film that is, quite empty and just filled with a lot of spectacle and not much story.
Well, exactly. I mean, I don't know. I mean, he could have been a more extreme version of Magneto. His relationship to Magneto is what Magneto's is to Professor X. But a sort of really aggressive, fuck it, let's kill everyone. The way they've treated mutants is just no longer tolerable. I'm going to not just kill all the humans, I'm going to knock over the fucking planet. But they didn't really go there.
They could have had an interesting. I guess they were trying to go for this with Magneto trying to find where he sits on that spectrum, but there's just not enough of it in this film because there's just too many other things going on, most of which were pointless. Next up, we'll be discussing Preacher, the new AMC show based on the dark fantasy comic from Garth Ennis and Steve Dillon. I first heard of Preacher about 10 years ago when comic book films was starting to become a thing, and Empire magazine did a list of, I think it was like the top 10 comics they'd like adapted that probably never will be adapted. Preacher was one of the ones that featured heavily. They always said that it's a great story, but the sort of combination of the dark take on religion and the level of violence means that it may not be palatable by the average cinema audience. It's found life on an American cable show. It lives up to its reputation of being darkly religious and quite violent. But Nick, what were your thoughts?
I quite liked it. It definitely did a good job of setting up a sort of a visual style and introducing the characters. And I think with Preacher, the characters are the main thing for a lot of people. So, yeah, the fact that they had Jessie, Tulip and Cassidy in there, as well as some minor characters, and all the actors were good. Ruth Negga was very good as Tulip, definitely showing that she was massively wasted in her tiny role in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Joseph Gilgun was always going to be good as Cassidy. I remembered him from his role as Rudy in Misfits, and he was always, that was always perfect casting.
Yeah.
Dominic Cooper as Jesse. He didn't get the most cool stuff to do. He was kind of doing the sort of mopey man angst in the first episode and leaving sort of Tulip and Cassidy to do all the fun stuff, jumping out of planes and whatever. Yeah, based on his first episode, there's a risk he may suffer from least interesting character in his own show syndrome.
It did the work of a pilot quite ably in that it manoeuvred the main characters into the position from which, a TV show could follow. I could see basically kind of, what direction this is heading in. The first half of this hour-long pilot, I was a bit iffy with, but by the second half of the pilot I did really like, and I certainly got more into it as it went on. When it started, it did have a few sort of cliches, or at least things that I've seen before and not executed in a particularly original way. I mean, you've got a character who used to be a criminal, has a dark past. I mean, there were a few bits of violence that were kind of obviously quite in your face, quite aggressive. I thought it was shot very beautifully as well. It looked really good, and they did a beautiful job of photographing Texas and making it look atmospheric. But at first I thought it was kind of, a supernatural crime thriller by numbers.
There are, I guess, quite a lot of broadly crucifix-themed supernatural crime shows going around, so I think they're sort of hoping to merge it with a sort of cowboy aesthetic to try and give it a bit of its own voice, and the sort of weird combinations of Tulip as this tough assassin and Cassidy as a vampire. Yeah, it came out of nowhere in the comic, to be fair. He was just a drunk Irish guy who randomly started biting people. In fact, in the comic, I think they postponed the reveal that Cassidy was a vampire for a few issues rather than putting it in his first scene.
I thought Cassidy was probably my favourite character. The actor who played it did it absolutely brilliantly, and it's real panache. I guess sometimes in these shows, one of the easiest parts to do well is the kind of the sort of sociopathic sidekick, the one who's powerful and unrestrained, because he can be just completely over the top.
Cassidy has the sort of scene-stealing breakout character all over him. I mean, he was always kind of designed that way. He gets to do more of the fun stuff, whereas Jessie and Tulip, and especially Jessie, are kind of landed with the task of doing the angst.
Yeah. The Jessie character, I mean, it's harder to get that kind of moral core. He's got some degrees of complexity. He's, it would be easier to do him as like a straight hero, a sort of, Steve Rogers, Captain America, whiter than white figure. He's got a dodgy past. He's trying to, sort of find a moral and righteous path. He's questioning whether God exists, whether he's in the right role as a preacher, whether he should have gone back to his own town.
I don't know, like a lot of pilots, it was a very piloty pilot. It suffered a bit from the need to do a load of setup and to sort of tour around the potential supporting cast, giving everyone a couple of scenes.
Yeah, I guess that's an inevitable thing about a pilot. I think, in the next few episodes, if they focus in on kind of one story that's like kind of overlapping all of the main characters, that'll be better. I mean, interesting to see where they go with this. There's certainly in the second half, when they kind of ramped it up more, they had, there were some bits that I found generally quite unsettling, and that was very good. There was the sheriff character, who himself I felt was a bit cliched, but then they introduced his son, who's had some form of, accident or something's happening to him, and the scene between Jesse and the son was really, really well done. It's a very effective scene, and that really kind of brought me back.
The son is, well, we'll see how faithful it is an adaptation, but the son is basically the comics character Arseface, who I don't know if we're going to call him Arseface. I suspect, much like in the comic, he may pick up that nickname as soon as he meets Cassidy. I mean, the difference of the comics seems to primarily be that they seem to be committing to this, at least for a while, setting it in the town where he's doing his preaching, whereas in the comics, his preaching gig has been kind of annihilated within about the first half issue, because the mysterious thing that happens to him happens right at the beginning of the story, and as well as giving him his powers, it blows up his church and kills the congregation. And then he just immediately sets off on this sort of road trip with Tulip and Cassidy.
I can see with this why they wanted to give ground it in one location, at least for a while. They wanted to build up like a town with a range of characters, just so they can go into these characters' lives. Because I felt if it was on the road, it could become very Adventure of the Week. It would just be they go to this town, there's something weird going on, they solve the mystery, they move on. It's difficult to build up, reoccurring characters and a broad sort of character-based plot arc if you're going to move locations between each story. So I can see why they may have opted, at least for a while, to stick it in one location and go into kind of those characters in more detail.
Yeah, I will be curious if basically they successfully ruin this town by the end of season 1, and then there's a bit of a cast refresh in season 2, with the exception of the main 3, but obviously we were wide off that happening.
That's probably the direction they'll go in. Right at the end of the episode.
The old open your heart scene.
Yeah, obviously this is a spoiler if anyone's not seen it yet, but yeah, there is a bit when Jesse seems to be imbued with some kind of supernatural power. We're not really sure what it is. It appears to be targeting religious leaders. We see it target a Catholic preacher in a generic African country. We see it target a Russian Orthodox church leader or patriarch. We see it targets Tom Cruise as well, which was the sort of thing, I guess, him being a...
Exactly, that's the sort of little touch I enjoy. That was a sort of incredibly grim comedy, which again, the sort of open your heart thing kind of was.
Yeah, and then it goes into Jesse, and one of these strange abilities it gives people is, I think, everything they're told, everything he says someone has to do, they're like compelled to do it.
Basically, if it's like the comic, that's basically his prime power or ability. That's basically what he can now do.
It's what they call it in the novel Dune. It's the voice, basically, and it's something that crops up in a lot of superhero things. Yeah,
I mean, the sort of over-literal demonstration in the comics, he told someone to go fuck yourself, and yeah. Not on panel, but yeah, that happened. And
I guess
and yes, I guess unless the iconic "go fuck yourself" scene is coming in a later episode,
might be saving that.
They seem to have replaced it with "open your heart."
Yeah, I mean, there's quite an annoying sort of member of his congregation who's constantly asking for advice about his mother, and Jesse, I guess, in good faith, tells him to open your heart to his mother, meaning tell your mother how you honestly feel about her, and obviously he interprets it quite literally.
I was assuming from the way it was intercut with Jesse's final sermon, where he sort of expresses a desire to, sincerely try and save people.
Yeah.
And then his first effort is this bloke ripping his own heart out. I wasn't sure whether that was meant to be, a clear implication that it's not going to go very well, or if it was just random dark lols. I think it was too clearly placed against his sermon to not be an actual point.
I assume that one of the main plot arcs the rest of the series will be him trying to use this ability for good and not evil, or at least not for random violence. But I assume there might also be some element of choice in it, which is that, I know a Catholic priest, which he is, Catholics believe that it's faith and action that will save you, whereas I think Protestants feel slightly differently about that. And I assume there's going to be an issue of that if he tells people to do good, but they're only doing good because they're compelled to do it by what he says, they're not actually being good. So I hope they get at some point into exploring that can he use this ability to force people to behave well? Can he use that to make people actually behave well of their own free will? As a preacher, he's supposed to encourage people to, I guess, be nice to each other rather than just force them to be nice to each other because he can.
Yeah, as I genuinely don't know, because as I say, this whole Jesse making a second go at being a preacher and trying to actually use his ability alongside his flock is a sort of crossover that doesn't happen in the comic at all. So yeah, they've successfully created some suspense even in me, someone who read the comic like a decade ago. It's possible they might just end up proving that the comic started the story at the right place and they're starting it too early, but,
So they are going in a slightly different direction with the TV show?
Well, as I say, if it ends in him basically destroying his hometown and then he and the other two just set off at the end on a road trip, then I guess they've just got to the same place in a slightly more circuitous way. But yeah, this bit of him trying to save people in his hometown is, it's new, it's interesting, and I think it's the good approach to adaptation, which is to try and capture the soul of the characters, but actually try and adapt the material and adapt the tone to the format you're putting it into and the time you're showing it.
It has to be like a story in its own right, and if the story works better this way on television, then obviously they'll need to veer away from the comic to make it a story that works well in the medium of television. And like I say, if they want to avoid a kind of Scooby-Doo-esque Adventure of the Week format, they will need to base it in one place and have a reoccurring cast of characters that they can explore in more detail.
Yeah, I mean, there weren't any obvious, here's the ongoing plot, but there was just sort of hints of mysterious people looking for Jesse's possession thing, whatever it is. Mysterious people looking for Cassidy, other mysterious people helping Cassidy, Tulip's involved in some job.
Yeah, I guess one of the recurring plots will be Tulip's heist.
Yeah, again, the vaguest role seems to be Jesse, who's just got this vague idea, I guess, implanted in him by whatever possesses him, that he should try and save people instead of just pissing off.
The other thing is there are two people who seem to be hunting this thing that's in Jesse, and they come across as not quite human, or possibly something that isn't human pretending to be human. Like, they keep getting things that are human subtly wrong, like eating a tea bag rather than drinking the tea, or the way they always dress is just slightly wrong for the period. Like, they went to Africa and they dressed in kind of 19th century colonial clothes.
Oh yeah, if nothing else, being pursued by them is presumably going to give Jesse something to worry about.
Yeah.
In fact, it looks like which everyone's probably got someone pursuing them at this stage. Which again, I guess makes it odd that they seem to have committed to the show staying in one place, because obviously, if something's chasing them, or all of them individually, they can't really just leave.
The other major plot thread is these bizarre thing that's possessed Jesse and has possessed these other people before, caused all the previous people it possessed to explode. I think that's why in the first scene we see it exploding the Catholic priest in Africa. And obviously, like I say, it's implied that it exploded Tom Cruise. I assume it's moving from religious leader to finding a host that it can survive in. But I guess there's still this element of inevitably Jesse at some point will explode unless he can get this thing out of him.
Yeah, I don't know if they're going that way, if it's just that Jesse's the right match and therefore won't explode. I'm not sure. That's not something that was explicitly handled much in the comic. I think I do remember the rough tone of why it chose Jesse, and presumably the reason it chose Jesse is why it didn't choose the others, or why the others weren't compatible.
But maybe there'll be an element if he loses whatever that element of compatibility is, he might, like I say, just sort of explode in a sort of spontaneous combustion of, fluids and internal organs.
I feel like the odds of them killing off the preacher in Preacher are probably quite small.
I don't think they'll kill him off, but I think it's certainly something they can make sort of drama out of. Like, the more cynical he is, the more compatible he is with the host creature. If he, discovers some kind of warmth and optimism, that could then ultimately lead to his death. Maybe they'll take it in that kind of direction.
I might be wrong, but based on all the brooding and all the talking and all the sort of slow shots of people, it doesn't seem like this is a show that's going to get that carried away with, I don't know, the exact fake science of whatever's possessing Jesse. I feel like they're probably just going to go, right, he has the thing lets him do this. It's mostly about, how positively or negatively he impacts the rest of the world as he tries to deal with this, and, how it affects him and his mates, rather than let's really dig into the pseudoscience of it.
And also, there are people hunting it, and now I guess hunting Jesse.
Well, as I say, that's a drive to the plot, I guess. Ross tweeted into us, who both listens to the podcast and, to be fair, is also a personal friend of mine, but anyway, tweeted in saying it went on a bit, which, yeah, it does meander, especially the Jesse parts. There's, they've clearly chosen this arc for the first episode, which involves Jesse moping around a bit until he gets possessed and finds some purpose, and the unfortunate part is obviously you commit to an hour of moping and then you've actually got to watch an hour of moping. I mean, obviously, it's a feature adaptation, I'll be watching it regardless, and partly I liked a lot of the rest of the trappings, I liked the way it was shot. I'm hoping that now that he's got his groove back or whatever, it'll be maybe a bit more directed and zippy. They could maybe have got the same plot into 40 minutes instead of a special bonus hour-long slot, and it would have been a bit punchier, I don't know.
That might have come across as being rushed, but I do agree that it did go on a bit. It was perhaps a bit slow-paced, but I think it's because they had to thoroughly introduce the three main characters and the circumstance, plus build up the kind of much larger supporting cast of characters. The other people in the town. There's three other families that Jesse interacts with. There's one who owns an abattoir. There's the family of the aforementioned sheriff with the son, and there's also the family of the woman who does the music for the church. So they have to build up all these supporting characters, and they also have to build up his kind of past trauma involving the death of his father. So they did have a lot to get around in the first episode.
Yeah, the other point I wanted to raise from Ross's tweet was that he said he couldn't always hear what they were saying. I actually also found, but to be honest, my hearing is not 20/20 amazing. So when I have that in shows, I usually just turn up the volume and assume it's because I'm deaf. Did you have that?
Actually, funny enough, I did as well. About halfway through, through, I turned the volume up a lot because I thought I couldn't hear it. But again, I've got years of listening to punk music on headphones at like really loud volume has done a number on my hearing. So I assumed that it was just me. But yeah, no, I did find it was quite quiet.
I mean, to be fair, this happens to me with a few shows nowadays. Again, possibly just getting old. The sound of the dialogue always seems quite quiet compared to the sound of the music and incidental effects. It did seem particularly noticeable during sort of midsection of feature. Also, Joseph Gilgun's fake, thick Irish accent. I did occasionally struggle to understand what he was actually saying, but
he does the character really well, and the accent is obviously part of the character, but it did make it at times difficult to understand. It is something I've noticed with, that generally music tends to be mixed up in the audio for a lot of TV shows and films, and vocals mixed down. It's something when I used to make films and stuff, it's actually a mistake people fall into quite easily, partly because directors and screenwriters and producers have worked with the script so many times that they know it really well, which means that the dialogue will come through much more clearly to the filmmakers because they know the script well, so when they're judging the mixing, they can get it wrong. It's definitely a mistake I've made in the past. It's possible that, I don't know if this was a last-minute turnaround, maybe they wanted to give the audio one more pass and didn't have time, but yeah, maybe it could have been improved if the dialogue was mixed up a bit and the music was mixed down a bit.
Yeah. In our survey of three, we appear to have all found it a bit quiet, so maybe there's something to it. Who knows? We'll see if that changes at all as the series goes on.
Yeah. But I was intrigued by it, and I can see why it as a comic has attracted such infamy, and why Empire Magazine would want to say, this is a great story, it would make a great film, but Hollywood is probably a bit too squeamish to make this. Fortunately, in a world that's post-Breaking Bad and Game of Thrones, television is more than happy to embrace this story, so I'm interested to see where it goes.
Well, feature has always been, for quite a long time, been described as unadaptable. I don't know, I guess it's some combination of the blasphemy, the, at times, extreme sex and violence, although I'm pretty sure Hollywood has had all of those things at times. And, I guess Garth Ennis' unique sense of humour in the comics, which can sometimes be best described as gay sex tee-hee, which was, I don't know. I think I've seen them do interviews, as in the showrunners do interviews, saying that material did not survive adaptation, so fair enough, really. It is a 20-year-old comic, sensibilities change.
Yeah, it is. It's like we were saying, they need to adapt it for this time and also for a different medium. I think there's one element of Hollywood has made kind of films that have caused moral outrages before, and films that have taken liberal attitudes with sex, violence and religion, but I think it's one thing to make a kind of a low budget gangster movie like King of New York or something that really I guess upset a lot of people, but to make a kind of a sort of supernatural thriller crime comic infused sort of film requires quite a lot of budget, at least to do it and it not look really stupid. So I think there was a concern that basically the bigger studios that have the kind of money to make Preacher would maybe not want to spend that kind of money on it because they're concerned it would offend a lot of people, it wouldn't appeal to a wide audience.
Yeah, it's also, I think, the sort of the genre mix thing. Preacher, especially the original comic, I don't know, it's quite hard to describe what it actually is. It's a sort of religious horror, fantasy, romance, crime, western. I don't really know. It's not just genre. It sort of swings wildly from this is deadly serious drama to this is stupid to this is funny to not only is this serious drama, but we're actually laughing at it as we do it.
That's the sort of thing I think actually could work really well in a TV adaptation because different episodes can embrace one aspect more than the other. So they might do an episode that features more on the Tulip character, and that episode will be more crime. If they do an episode that focuses on the Cassidy character, then that may be more horror or, I guess, dark religion intake, and they could do an episode that's maybe a bit more tongue-in-cheek and doesn't take itself very seriously, and then do an episode that does take itself deadly seriously. They've already explored issues of domestic violence, they've explored issues of how, I guess, disabled people or are kind of sort of socially ostracized. They've touched on issues of faith and tolerance and forgiveness. So they've touched on a lot of serious issues. They've also had some...
They've also spun off a sort of a super cool crime sequence, a weird comedy vampire sequence where he drags a cow into a pit. And yeah, it is. The sort of weird swing in terms of tone and genre is evident in the pilot, and possibly it's part of what makes it a bit clunky at times, but... Yeah, I don't know. It's Preacher.
That's good. And it was doing a lot of stuff, and it did a lot of stuff well. There wasn't anything that stood out as particularly bad. The only thing I really didn't like is it did play into a few stereotypes about Africa. It was kind of... We've got 2 American states mentioned in the subtitles, but the African country doesn't even get a name. It's just Africa. And it's, and obviously it's poor and they live in a dump.
There's some cheap visual shorthand going on there, isn't there? Especially when they could have just used an elderly Catholic priest in England or something.
Yeah, or anywhere in the world, really. Or just somewhere in Africa that's not doesn't play into a huge
somewhere specific
stereotype.
in Africa. Yeah, fair enough. And next up, it's the Nazi-themed survival thriller Green Room, directed by Jeremy Saulnier and starring Patrick Stewart as a Nazi, moving a little away from his values as Professor X. And that'll probably be my last X-Men reference, as I've seen enough interviews with Patrick Stewart promoting this to know that he's thoroughly sick of people asking him about X-Men or Star Trek every few minutes. This is a survival horror thriller type film, where a band go to play at a venue in the middle of nowhere, but turns out to be quite heavily dominated by a sort of far-right skinhead Nazi community, and accidentally stumble across some stuff and end up locked in the green room and struggling to survive against the Nazis who basically want to eliminate them because of what they've seen. And yes, I thought it was really good. I thought it was a very lean, straight down sort of survival horror film, very good, very well constructed. I really like this. Alastair, what did you think?
Yeah, I think it's a great film. It's really tense, shocking, edge of your seat sort of, stuff. I saw this at the London Film Festival last year, and it was probably the best thing I saw at the film festival, and it was absolutely excellent. And I'm glad it's got a distribution deal and is now out in cinemas. So, and I really enjoyed seeing it again. I think just to sort of compare it to X-Men Apocalypse, what Green Room does well is the lack of story. And the story is very straightforward. There's 4 guys, 3 dudes and a girl. They're in a band. They play punk. They're trying to make it as a punk band. They take this gig, something goes wrong, a siege follows as sort of the Nazis who run the place again are trying to kill them. And it's quite a tight, focused, minimal story, maximum tension. It's the exact opposite of what everything's wrong with X-Men Apocalypse, which is just like too much story, too much spectacle, it's too big, it's too noisy. Whereas this is it does a lot with a little.
Well, yeah, it breaks down to this sort of core of, okay, literally all that's standing between us and being murdered by some Nazis is that door.
Yeah.
It's very sort of in the moment, on that tiny detail, these small things matter, whereas, yeah, as you say, something like X-Men Apocalypse, when you're like destroying whole cities with a wave of your massive blue Smurf hand, it gets a bit vague and distant.
Yeah, and I really liked how they focused on the tension. And there wasn't like an enormous amount of characterization, but you did get a sense of each character, so where they were coming from, and enough that you felt for them. You were worried about them. You were emotionally invested in their survival, which also made it quite a pleasant experience when any of them got killed. And there is quite a high body count to this film, and it is one of those films where main characters you might really like, do get offed in quite violent ways.
Well, yeah, again, the strength is the relatability of it. You can sort of imagine being in this situation because, we've all got doors, we've all heard of Nazis.
They don't do anything like that's obviously stupid to get them into this situation. It's just unfortunate turn of events in their parts lead them to basically being, sort of hunted and killed by these Nazis. It's not one of those films when you think like, well, that's the point, you did something really stupid that you shouldn't have done. You could see how, given, some bad luck, you could end up in that situation yourself.
Well, yeah, the shit happens of it, the sort of stupid, coincidental way they ended up in this particular situation, which felt more believable again, and therefore more scary, than the Nazis turning out to be serial killers who grind people up into mincemeat or something.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the other things I really liked about this film is because it's an indie film, it doesn't really, other than Patrick Stewart, who plays kind of the villain, the leader of the Nazis, there isn't like a famous star in it, and, there isn't really like a main character, so you don't know who's going to die. There's like no main actor that is going to like survive to the end, or at least near the end. At any point, basically any of the characters could be off, and sometimes the characters are just suddenly, just killed like that, and it really adds to the tension of like basically anyone could go at any moment.
Well, yeah, there's no single big actor doing a performance, is there? There's no obvious big focus in on this person. I mean, the closest you get to that is Patrick Stewart, and they do sort of a bit build to the oh shit, it's Patrick Stewart moment, when they sort of don't show his face for his first few seconds of intro. And then he plays it in this really sort of softly spoken way.
Yeah, you hear his voice first, and obviously he has a very recognisable voice, but he's doing this sort of American accent, and you kind of, you do that sort of, that's a familiar voice. And then, obviously then you see him, and it is great to see him playing against type so much. I mean, Patrick Stewart is very popular on the internet because you can clearly tell he does come across generally as a nice person, from taking pictures with Ian McKellen that's sort of Pride in Los Angeles, just, to generally delivering very, interviews that are very warm and friendly. He does come across as a nice guy, and also he's played, some very positive characters. And he does a really good villain, but he doesn't ham it up loads. He could have made the this a massive Nazi stereotype, whereas he does the character with a degree of subtlety, and he convinces you that this is a real person.
Well, yeah, it's again the sort of the softly spoken evilness of it, like all these things which through decades of watching movies or whatever, you know that at a certain point a bad thing's going to happen. And the film is sort of, I think, aware of that and sort of plays off that. Like, there's the bit where the first time Patrick Stewart speaks to them, he's being very sort of, okay, guys, we're just going to help get you out of here as quickly as possible. We both want the same thing. Let's work together. I'm your friend. And because you've seen films, and because they haven't pissed around, you've heard him basically talk about killing them before that. You know it's going to, at some point, he's just going to savage them. Something ridiculously bad is going to happen. And you're just sort of waiting for it. And the film clearly knows that tension is there and actually works it and then delivers on it.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, and there's this element of escalation from all sides. Like, at first, the Nazis are trying to kill them in a way that, they can sort of disguise, and cover it up. And they realise they have to off the band because they witnessed the murder. So their first plan is to make it look like these guys were trespassing and they were sort of killed by a guard dog. And it escalates, and then they sort of, get more violent and more angry. And, again, the tension builds up as the film escalates. And I find it especially tense because one of my biggest fears is having a guard dog set on you. Okay. So yeah, seeing that again was quite unpleasant, especially when you see like scenes when dogs are like biting people's throats and stuff. It's if you're squeamish about violence, then I wouldn't recommend it.
But yeah, obviously this is an action horror film. People die, there is blood. But yeah, sorry, I thought you were about to unveil your intense lifelong phobia of Nazis or something.
I think I'm quite scared of having Nazis try to kill me.
I'm quite scared of having a Nazi set on me. So am I, to be fair.
Yeah, tension is what this film has in spades, and it works really well. And I think it's a real lesson in how, less is more, how you can do a lot with not much. You can keep it close, keep it small space, build up the tension.
Well, yeah, it's a short film, just over 90 minutes. It does the business, it's very lean.
Yeah.
Impressively, pretty much everyone, even like quite a few of the sort of background Nazis who are trying to kill them, has a sort of an arc or an agenda or a point. Yeah, there's a resistance to them just all being disposable henchmen.
Yeah.
Which is good. I guess having raved about it for 10 minutes, criticism-wise, as you said, there's not a huge amount of like, let's do characterisation time, but perhaps as a result of that, I didn't feel... I was very excited and very following it and very in the story, but I wasn't mega invested. Like, I didn't feel uncontrollably sad or despairing when people died. I just felt, oh, that's a shame they're dead.
It's shocking more than saddening.
Yeah, exactly. It was a good story, well told. But yeah, I never felt, oh no, a life snuffed out. It never came close to tugging on my emotions.
That is an element of a film that, moves quite fast and doesn't give much time over to character.
I'm quite aware that the director of Where We Here might well say I was not trying to do that. I was just trying to tell my story efficiently. I wanted you to be shocked and in attention. I did not want you to stop to have a cry, and fair enough.
Yeah, and it achieves what it set out to do. One of the things I really like about this film is there is a kind of whole subgenre of one-room, low-budget films. And, obviously, in my past, I've made short movies and stuff and worked on films a bit. And it is something within, like, the independent filmmaking scene. There's always this element of, we don't have much money, we need to come up with an idea that is going to be quite cheap. And then people go, well, the obvious thing is, why don't we just set it all in one room? And, we'll come. And then this necessity to save money has spawned, like, say, an entire subgenre of one-room independent films. A lot of them are quite bad because it's really hard to sustain tension when you only have one room. And a lot of the films just become ridiculous as well, and some of them are quite gimmicky. And I think this film avoided all of that, all those cliches. But I mean, it was more than just one room. It mainly took place in the green room, but there's a bit before and a bit after. But yeah, it didn't just fall completely for the low budget gimmick. It did create a sense of tension and, told a really good story. I mean,
yeah, I like the way that they made the green room feel like a sort of a trap or a black hole or something they just couldn't get away from. Like, every time they went out of the green room to try and escape, there was a bit of struggling. Usually someone died, and they inevitably just end up back there.
Yeah, because it's the only sort of safe space they had.
Yeah, which ends up feeling like this weird combination of it's their safe space and also it's obviously awful. So yeah, it was interesting how that ended up feeling. I felt like it maybe lost a bit of momentum once they left the green room. The last 10 minutes were not the best 10 minutes.
It was very much in the film's winding down at this point, but I think they passed the kind of big dramatic moment, which is, I guess, the final kind of fight in the green room, which I thought was very well done. And you had a sense of, like, even though there's like they're quite tough, quite nasty Nazis coming to get them, you got a sense of, like, they're not like soldiers or professional killers. They make mistakes. They can be tricked and trapped. So that the actual climactic scene of the film had a lot of tension because of this kind of cat and mouse between two characters that were all both a bit out of their element, both a bit unsure. And it worked really well.
But for me, the big emotional release of the film, I guess, was when the survivors, whoever they may be, managed to actually leave the building that they'd been trapped in for most of the film. And, they'd done such a good job making the green room feel like this prison cell for them. But yeah, when they managed to actually step out into the outside world, it was a sort of exhale, this is it moment. And that was kind of the problem, really. That felt like the sort of climax bit, and then, yeah, there was some other stuff after that, which inevitably felt like a bit of an afterthought. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that was the kind of the climactic moment of the film. The rest of it was just kind of wrapping up the plot. But, and it didn't dwindle on the denouement too long. It moved quite quickly through it, and then, to the end. And then, at the point where there was no more story, the film stopped, and it's a good lesson in, less is more, kind of tell your story than get out of there. Last week, I recommended Nick listen to Cammell Laird Social Club, an album from Half Man Half Biscuit. They're a post-punk band with comedy lyrics that take the piss out of the middle class. This was the first of their albums that I listened to. But Nick, what did you think?
Well, I felt I was slightly missold this as comedy music, because with the exception of a couple of tracks, it's not really comedy music. But that aside, it's fun. Unfortunately, I as well as comedy music, I also quite like sort of, I guess, what you call post-punk. It's not a term I'd heard until I was talking to you about this. But yeah, sort of punk with a bit of a twist on it, probably slightly less hard punk. Stuff like Frank Turner and the Pogues. And this doesn't sound unlike those. In particular, it doesn't sound unlike Frank Turner, except, as you say, with slightly more light-hearted lyrics.
Yeah, it's definitely, they've got that kind of, sort of punk sensibility. It's, it's quite fast. It's, they've got they're sort of pounding out chords. There's a sarcasm that runs through the whole thing, and it kind of runs through everything they do. They're in favour of kind of, poking the bubbles of sort of middle-class pomposity. I think it's the second track on the album, which is, called When the Sun Goes Down, which has a great line, which is it cafe bars, pigeons and idiots, there's too many of these in this town.
But yeah, I mean, it's the unpretentiousness of the lyrics, I guess, that makes it work for me. I mean, I'm not averse to punk music, but I don't necessarily listen to a lot of what I guess you call hardcore punk, just because there's a certain pomposity that I find a bit off-putting at times. I mean, I unfortunately a bit too cynical and sarcastic to listen to the old "smash the system, then eat my balls" or whatever with any sincerity. Something sillier like this is a bit more what I'm after.
There are some songs, I suppose, that are more like straight comedy, such as there's the the Referee's Alphabet.
To be honest, I felt like those were kind of the weakest, or at least those are ones where, like a lot of comedy music, you hear it once and then you've heard it, or at least twice.
Yeah, it's sort of funny the first time, I suppose, because there isn't really much musically to those songs. It is just a joke. I did like the one, Breaking News, the song, which is about the police are arresting people who are accused of annoying the nation.
Yeah, of the two overt comedy songs, which is that one and the Referee's Alphabet, Breaking News was definitely the better one. But yeah, the ones I liked more were the ones that were sort of straight songs, where it's got like a bit more musical energy, it's got a bit of an actual chorus and stuff, but he's still sort of poking fun at, or sometimes just shouting about the middle class.
Yeah, like there's one like She's in Broadstairs. It was quite funny, just because how often does Broadstairs get mentioned in a song?
I liked the two songs, Them's the Vagaries and If I Had Possession Over Pancake Day. That 5 minutes is possibly my favourite bit of the album, actually. I'm a big fan of those two songs together.
They're very good. Them's the Vagaries especially is a very funny song. I did like the one which is 27 Yards of Dental Floss, that's kind of one of the sort of harder and faster songs on the album.
Yeah.
And it's got a great chord sequence, and it's really just pounded out, and it's a really energetic, sort of upbeat song you can get quite enthusiastic about.
Yeah, and the last track, Thy Damnation, Slumber of Knots, with a lot of random lyrics and shouting, and yeah.
That was good. And there was the Paradise Lost, which is, again, that's one that pokes fun at the middle class quite a lot. But also, I guess, is, and references Milton, I suppose.
Yeah, it was fun. It was catchy. It was intelligent without being smug, and it's a sort of a voice I don't hear that much in music, because even like I mentioned Frank Turner earlier, and then I mentioned pretentious punk music, and although Frank Turner isn't pretentious in a smash the system way, he is sometimes a bit pretentious in the I'm singing about universal human experiences and emotions way.
Yeah, Frank Turner, I think, takes himself incredibly seriously, and what I like about Half Man Half Biscuit is they don't take themselves incredibly seriously, which is refreshing.
Well, yeah, I mean, to be honest, a lot of the better Frank Turner ones, I'm going to go full annoying music fan and say his earlier albums were in fact better. But yeah, that part of that was he used to sing a bit more about specific instances or specific people and events from his life, or, well, I assume from his life, or maybe from a fictionalised Frank Turner's life. Whereas he has moved a bit more in the last couple of albums into I'm singing about the universal human experience, and as a result, they're not as good.
Yeah, this is done in a similar vein, but it's quite, I know, it's really kind of refreshingly sort of, laid back, Half Man Half Biscuit. Like I say, it's it's completely unpretentious. It's got its tongue firmly in cheek. It's something you can definitely enjoy without worrying you're taking it too seriously. Although this album does have a sort of serious point to it in one sense, which is that it's called Cammell Laird Social Club, which is an actual social club somewhere in the Wirral, which is where Half Man Half Biscuit are from. And obviously it's a joke on the 1997 album Buena Vista Social Club. And again, this is popping sort of bubble of middle-class pomposity, but you're making the point of, there's a lot of middle-class people got very excited about the Buena Vista Social Club, sort of saying that it's really important that, this kind of working-class Cuban music really says something, that's important and timeless about the human condition. And their response is, that's fair enough, but you would never be caught dead listening to any working-class British music. How come it's valuable because it seems somewhat exotic and also allows you to show off how cultured you are. What's going on in Cammell Laird is as significant as what's going on in Buena Vista. It's just, one makes you look more cultured, so therefore it's considered more valuable by the middle class.
I got the title was a reference because I think in one of the first couple of tracks he mentions the Buena Vista Social Club CD, but I had no idea what the connotations of that actually were. I just assumed from his tone that it was an album liked by middle class people.
Yeah, which is it, and I like the fact it's kind of making a sort of serious point, but in a sort of tongue-in-cheek way. It's kind of, again, he's poking fun at middle-class people in their ways.
But yeah, I mean, obviously I'm not, as I think I've probably put across by now, not huge in punk culture, although it did strike me as entertaining. We were covering this in the same week as Green Room, which clearly has a lot of affection for punk culture. Yeah,
I mean, that's a film that does punk in a different way, and that's they're more hardcore punk, and they're sort of in a band that's kind of really really like heavy. I mean, you don't really hear much of the Ain't Rights songs in Green Room. That's what the band is, I believe. Called the Ain't Rights. But there is a great bit though. It's probably one of my favourite bits in Green Room when they cover the Dead Kennedys' "Nazi Punks Fuck Off." And you've got to give them credit for having the balls to play "Nazi Punks Fuck Off" in front of a group of Nazi punks.
Yeah, we've crossed the streams a bit here, but I quite like that bit's place in the film, just because it's going to broadly be a horror film because of, the fact that you go into a film knowing roughly what kind of film it is. And then they do this sort of stupid thing to antagonise the Nazi punks. You're then sort of thinking, is that going to be why they get locked in the green room and then killed? And of course, it's not that. It's something even more banal and coincidental.
Catches you by surprise.
Yes. And yeah, it was a nice sort of framing for the film, just because, as I say, the director or the writer, are they the same person?
It's the same person who wrote and directed. He also made a film called Blue Ruin, which I haven't seen, which is supposed to be really good. I do want to see it. Yeah,
Jeremy Soldier clearly has a lot of affection for punk culture, and he works that in, and there's a lot of background detail, and it makes it seem like an actual convincing portrayal of that culture without it drowning the film. I mean, ultimately, you can relate to these people are locked in a room and they're going to die, even if you have no idea about punk, but yeah.
Yeah, and he was in a punk band, and in fact, that
does not surprise me in the slightest.
Yeah, I saw a Q&A with him at the London Film Festival, and I think he said that some of the Ain't Right songs are songs he and his friends wrote when they were in a punk band, in their teenage years. And I think apparently there's going to be an album of the music from the film, and he says it's going to be really strange to see the songs that he wrote as a teenager on an album that's also going to have Minor Threat and the Dead Kennedys on it. So wow, I guess he's achieving his teenage punk dreams.
Well, why not?
And if you're going to make
a film, he deserves it.
Yeah, if you're going to make a film, why not use it to achieve your teenage dreams?
But yeah, and looping back round on point somehow. Yeah, the Half Man Half Biscuit, although it's not as sort of hard punk shouting Nazis fuck off as the music in Green Room, they're still tweaking their section of the establishment in their way.
Yeah, I think it's,
as you say, the middle class or whatever.
I do like the fact that pretty much every Half Man Half Biscuit album title mentions a place. Like this one is Cammell Laird Social Club. They did an album called CSI Ambleside, because and possibly my favourite album title of all time, which is Trouble Over Bridgewater. Think about it. It's funny.
Yeah, I would be curious actually, because they're still going, aren't they? They're still releasing.
I'm pretty sure they're still releasing stuff. They did an album not too long ago. They've done quite a few albums. I mean, I mentioned those three. There are others.
Yeah, I'd be interested to maybe try one of their later albums to see what they make of current society that I could actually remember. 2002, this came out. I was 18. I cannot pretend I was mega involved in the wider culture when I was 18. I was mostly involved in Spider-Man.
So, for next time, what are you going to be recommending to me, Nick?
Ooh. Well, I came up with a TV recommendation and a comics recommendation. I think I'm going to go for the comic, because we are, as you'll find out in a few minutes, listeners, going to be doing a comic next week anyway. But obviously I can't control whether that one's good, but I can control whether this one's good. So, yeah, that gives me a reassuring sense of power.
So that's great. What have you got for me?
Okay, my recommendation is Black Panther the Client by Christopher Priest and Mark Texeira, which was published by Marvel in, I think, the very late 90s. And yeah, I thought since you seem to enjoy Black Panther in the Civil War film, this would be fun. It's one of my favourite comics. I've seen actual hardcore Black Panther fans say they don't like it as much because Christopher Priest's take on the Black Panther is a bit of a departure from other takes on the Black Panther. And since I came to it as more a Christopher Priest fan than a Black Panther fan, you know, I can't necessarily deny them that. It's quite possible that it is wildly out of character, but it's one of my favourite comics, so you're getting it anyway.
Great. Well, I look forward to reading it. And I did really enjoy the Black Panther in Captain America Civil War, so it'd be great to find out how he was approaching the comic and, yeah, to find out more about the Black Panther.
Yeah, it also introduces Everett K. Ross, the character Martin Freeman played in the film, so hopefully that'll be interesting for you.
Oh, that'd be good, yeah.
The first storyline is the first 5 issues, so we'll talk about that next week, next fortnight. There we go, take a drink, everybody.
That's all we have time for this episode. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode of Moderate Fantasy Violence, then please stand up in the middle of your commute and yell at all the other people they should be listening to it too. If you don't want to do that, then you can tell your friends about us, or you can leave us a review on iTunes. It's all helpful. You can also follow us on Twitter. We're at MFV Podcast. You can also visit our website, moderatefantasyviolence.com, where you can listen to our previous episodes. You can also, if you go to the website, see my review of Kill Command, which we discussed briefly in the last episode.
And yep, also on the website, to cover for the lack of deleted scenes from the last episode, is a, some might say, unreasonably long essay by me in which I discussed the handling of the comics canon love interests in Flash and Arrow. If you like Flash and Arrow, it might be a really interesting piece. If you don't like Flash and Arrow, I'll be honest, you might struggle to get through it. I do also mention briefly the handling of the Steve Sharon relationship in Civil War, which I know is a popular topic for some. So yep, that's up there, and we also have a Tumblr, which we're occasionally trying to do some tumbling on at moderatefantasyviolence.tumblr.com. So feel free to check us out in any of those venues, but the iTunes reviews would be especially good. So yep, I've been Nick Bryan, as well as the essay on the website. You can find more from me, including news of my self-published crime books at nickbryan.com. Follow me on Twitter as @nickmb.
I've been Alastair Ball. You can find my writing about science fiction at nimbusspace.co.uk. You can find my writing about politics on redtrainblog.blogspot.com. You can also follow me on Twitter. I'm at Alastair J.R. Ball.
Okay, and that really is it. Next week, as well as Black Panther, as I alluded, we're doing another comic, which is the Dead Topical DC Rebirth special, which is meant to be the exciting beginning of a whole new era of DC superhero comics. So it's obviously going to be really accessible to a non-reader like Alastair. I'll be honest, guys, I'm concerned this might be a disaster, but we'll see. And then, as well as that, we might try one of the follow-up comics. I'm particularly intrigued by Tom King's Batman relaunch. So yep, we'll be with you in 2 weeks with that and some other stuff. Until then, bye-bye.
Bye. And the aforementioned amazingly titled Trouble Over Bridgewater.
Still don't get it.
Is Bridge Over Troubled Water?
Oh, now I feel bad for not getting it. I might edit this out. I might use my godlike powers to evade my own embarrassment.
Yes, okay. But it's a very funny album title.
Or I'll stick it in the tag after the credits so any hardcore fans can hear me making a prick of myself.